Adolf Hitler was a fanatical leader, a megalomaniac who led his country and many others into the abyss.
He screamed for mercy, but there was none left to give. Moments ago, he was an officer respected, feared, and obeyed. Now he was just a man on his knees, tied up in a muddy field, staring down the barrel of a rifle held by someone who remembered everything.
They're performing murder and terrible crimes, but at the same time trying to make it look as though it's correct.
When the Third Reich collapsed, the fall didn't come quietly. Across Europe, captured Nazis were dragged from bunkers, barns, and basements, not to face a courtroom, but to face those they once ruled through terror. There were no trials in these moments, no mercy, no delay, only reckoning. Let's dive into the brutal ends they never saw coming. When the tables turned, they thought they'd vanish into the smoke, that they could burn the world and then disappear with it. But war remembers faces, even when history forgets names. As Germany crumbled in 1945, the forests, basements, and borders were filled with men in panic. SS officers ripped off their insignias. Gestapo agents changed into civilian coats. High-ranking commanders tried to flee west, hoping to surrender to the Americans or British, anyone but the Red Army. But the East had its memories. In towns once emptied by roundups and raids, people now pointed fingers. In villages where families had vanished, survivors remembered boots and voices. Not all accusations were exact. Not every execution was lawful. But in the ruins, justice no longer wore robes. It carried a rifle. Some Nazis were captured, formally interrogated, tried, and sentenced. But many never made it to court. They were shot on sight, hanged from trees, forced to dig their graves. Soldiers once feared for disobedience, now feared for recognition. A tattoo, a photograph, a single witness. That was all it took. Others were offered a moment to kneel, speak, or beg. Some prayed, some screamed. Others just stared back as if daring the world to look away. But no one looked away. Because when the tide finally turned, the fire did not just consume buildings. It turned toward the ones who lit the match, and the silence that followed their deaths. It wasn't mercy, it was a memory-making room for what came next. No trial, no tears. Some wore fear on their faces, others wore pride, but none wore power anymore. They had once walked through cities with raised fists and polished boots, their shadows cast long across trembling streets. Now those same streets spat them out, bound, bruised, on their knees. For many, there was no verdict read aloud, no courtroom, no defense, just a nod from a man with a rifle, a gesture from a partisan. Sometimes not even that. The executioners were not soldiers anymore. They were widows, orphans, survivors. Some had numbers burned into their skin. Others had no one left to remember them. They didn't shout, they didn't hesitate. They had waited too long for this. In the forests of Poland, they dragged SS officers from hiding holes and haystacks. In Prague, mobs found collaborators and paraded them through the streets. In Yugoslavia, whole columns of captured Nazis were marched to ravines and never returned. Some pleaded for mercy, citing orders. Others swore they never knew. But the world was done listening to excuses. There were no hymns, no salutes, only the soft click of a weapon being readied. And then, stillness. After the smoke cleared, no one cried, not even the condemned. Somewhere in a collapsed farmhouse or burnt synagogue, their ghosts still linger. Not because they were mourned, but because the ones they silenced never got the chance to speak, and now the earth listened to them instead. The collapse of the uniform. In the final days, even the swastika seemed ashamed. Badges were buried in dirt, medals tossed into rivers. Black SS uniforms were replaced with plain coats, stolen shirts, civilian disguises, but no fabric could hide what they had done. Some tried to blend in among the refugees. Others carved out false papers, invented new names, new lives. One man claimed to be a farmer, another a school teacher. They spoke with new accents, avoided eye contact, and shaved their heads. But their hands still smelled of gunpowder. Their eyes never stopped scanning the edges of crowds. It didn't matter how far they ran. The war had marked them in ways they couldn't wash off. Their fear wasn't only of bullets, it was of being known, of a voice in a crowd suddenly shouting a name, of a survivor whispering one day, "That's him." Because even without evidence, memory pointed. And in a world torn apart by silence, a pointing finger could be a death sentence. Some of these men surrendered when caught, quiet, hollow. Others lashed out, denying everything. I was only following orders. I was a clerk. I never killed anyone. But the war had changed language. It no longer needed confessions. It read guilt in posture, in silence, in the twitch of a lip when asked a name. Their uniforms once made them untouchable. But when the world turned, those very same threads made them visible. And when justice came, it did not knock. It remembered and it answered. The eyes of the world.
The forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe.
By the spring of 1945, the war was ending, but the killing wasn't. What began in the shadows now stepped into the open. Town squares became stages. Burned-out factories turned into holding pens. The victors didn't just want surrender, they wanted witnesses. The world had seen too much death in silence. Now, it demanded to see death delivered. Some executions were filmed, photographed, documented, not to glorify them, but to remind them. These were not distant war heroes. These were men with names, with ranks, with choices, and now with ropes tightening around their necks. In Eastern Europe, retribution became a ritual. German soldiers captured on the run were lined up and shot before crowds. In Czechoslovakia, collaborators were dragged through the streets, spat on, and hanged from lampposts. In Yugoslavia, the forest drank the blood of entire regiments, not out of rage, but repetition. Each act is a punctuation mark in a long, unfinished sentence. Even some who watched felt a chill. Revenge had come, yeah, but it wore a face that looked uncomfortably human. The lines blurred. What was justice? What was vengeance? Sometimes it depended on the uniform. Sometimes it didn't. Some of the condemned walked silently. Others cursed the world that turned on them. One smiled as the rifle was raised, but none escaped what waited. Because the war had never truly been about nations. It had been about choices. And now the world was tallying those choices, one body at a time. The quiet executioners. Not all justice needed a crowd. Far from the cities, in the forests and fields where no cameras followed, men were still hunted, still found, still ended. But there was no shouting, no flags, only footsteps in the mud, the clink of handcuffs, the metallic breath of a loaded weapon. Partisans knew the terrain better than any map. They followed rumors, footprints, and cigarette ash left behind in barns. One officer was captured in a church confessional. Another was found hiding behind a wall of coal in a farmhouse cellar. They were not famous men, but their crimes had faces. Sometimes there were trials, makeshift, swift. Sometimes there weren't. A name spoken aloud, a whispered memory. That was enough. A few tried to talk. I didn't pull the trigger. You were there, came the reply. That was all it took. Others refused blindfolds. Some cried, some prayed, and some, as the muzzle met the back of the neck, simply closed their eyes. Not from peace, but from memory. They had seen what death looked like. Now they would feel it. Their bodies were left in ditches, buried in shallow graves, or burned. Some vanished without a record. Others were never identified at all. But in the stillness that followed, the executioners did not cheer. They turned away, lit cigarettes, sat down without speaking. Because revenge doesn't always scream. Sometimes it exhales and disappears into the smoke. The weight that didn't leave. The executions ended, but something stayed. Not in the air or the ruins, but inside the people who watched. Inside the men who pulled the triggers. Inside the towns that had been silent too long. There were no songs afterward, no flags raised in triumph, only silence. And silence, when it's too loud, becomes a kind of memory. Some of the executioners went home, started families, planted crops, rebuilt what they could, but some could not sleep. Some stopped speaking altogether. A few disappeared into the mountains, never to return. They had survived the war, but not the moment they looked into another man's eyes and saw fear and chose not to look away. In other places, monuments were built, names carved into stone. But not all names. Some were left off, erased, or quietly ignored. Even among the victors, not everyone could face what had happened. What does justice feel like when it finally arrives? For some, it brought closure. For others, more questions. Because the line between justice and vengeance is paper thin. And when history steps back, it doesn't always separate the two. It leaves them tangled, like bones beneath the soil. The bodies were buried, but the weight of them was not. It lingered. In letters never sent. In photographs no one has framed. In the silence that grew heavier with every passing year.
Now first, like always, be sure to hit the like button down below. It helps us out tremendously with the reach of this video. Thank you.
Aftermath of ashes. The war was over. The uniforms were gone, the guns are quiet, but peace didn't arrive with parades. It came as dust. In Germany, some families never asked questions. Others asked too many. A father who never came home. An uncle who changed his name. A photo hidden in a drawer. The stories passed down were vague. He was a soldier. That was all. In Eastern Europe, ruins stood for years before anyone dared to rebuild. Villagers still whispered about the man who disappeared, or the girl who pointed, or the boy who never returned from the woods. Justice had come, but not everywhere, not for everyone. Some perpetrators escaped. They fled to Argentina, Spain, and Syria, built new lives under new names. Some were caught years later. Others died free. But freedom isn't forgotten. Decades passed and still the name surfaced. A neighbor's accent, a document was uncovered, a scar remembered. The world kept digging, not for revenge, but for truth. Trials reopened, bones exhumed, films are played in classrooms. Survivors spoke softly into microphones. Their voices didn't shake from anger, but from the weight of carrying silence for too long. The war had written itself into the soil, the walls, the bloodlines. It could not be erased. And even when the execution stopped, the reckoning did not. It only changed form. The sons of ghosts. They didn't choose their fathers. They didn't wear uniforms. But the names of those stayed. Some grew up in silence, their homes filled with shadows, photographs tucked away, questions discouraged. A stern man at the dinner table always watching, his past unspoken, his presence heavy. Others were told early. He served. That was all. But over time, that single phrase began to burn. They read books, saw documentaries, and realized what that uniform truly meant. Some changed their names. Some tried to live lives of absolute decency as if to undo something they never did. A few defended what could not be defended. Most just tried to breathe under the weight of inherited guilt. They were not judged by law, but by glances, by teachers who paused at roll call, by strangers who remembered the war differently. A daughter once said, "I carry his face. Every mirror feels like a question," because the war ended, but the bloodlines remained. And legacy doesn't always ask permission. The image that doesn't fade. One image. A man kneels in the dirt. Behind him, a rifle is raised. No names, no context, just a moment, frozen before silence. Photos like this don't explain. They don't argue. They remember. They hang in quiet museums, tucked into yellowing archives, shown in classrooms when words fail. Not to glorify, not to forgive, just to remind. In some places, they're studied. Elsewhere, they're hidden, too raw, too close. But even unseen, they speak of what happens when power turns into permission, of what follows when no one says no. They haunt not because of who died, but because of what we allowed before they did. These aren't pictures of justice. They're echoes of the boots, the orders, the silence. And the lesson is not in the execution, it's in everything that led to it, because the past doesn't sleep. It lingers in old photographs, in old names, and sometimes it looks back. The reckoning never ends. Years passed, countries healed on the surface, but underneath the reckoning remained. In courtrooms across Europe, old men stood trial. Their hands shook, not from guilt, but age. Some wore suits, some wore silence. Most claimed they remembered nothing. Survivors, now grandparents, spoke softly. Their voices cracked not from emotion, but exhaustion. They had told their stories for decades, and still not all were heard. Outside, cameras waited, protesters held signs. Some cried for justice, others asked why it took so long. Inside, the truth was cold and heavy. Orders given, doors locked, children taken. These weren't war stories, they were memories that never left. But even beyond the courts, the questions spread. Into schools, into books, into homes where last names held secrets. The bullets stopped in 1945, but the reckoning, real, personal, never did. Because the danger wasn't just in what happened, it was in forgetting that it happened at all. And forgetting is always how it begins again. History remembers numbers, but memory keeps the faces. Courts judge some, others are in crowds, many by no one at all. The war ended, but the echoes did not. They live in the silence of old villages, in the cracks of family trees, in the names no one speaks aloud. Justice came like a storm, but storms do not heal. They clear the air, then leave you with what's broken. And beneath all that rubble, something remains. Not victory, not closure, just a question. If the past isn't buried, how many times will we have to dig it up again?